from the perspective of being halfway through this first wave, at least here in the United States, I would say that one thing that strikes me as being very positive is that the political fortunes of key populists, and I would say of populism and isolationism more broadly, perhaps even of kind of long-standing belief in individualism, which I think informs partly this populist movement that we've seen, that's all kind of coming apart. It's weakening, right? Because a pandemic is, of course, international by nature. The institutions that help to combat it and to prevent a pandemic tend to be multilateral. And even within countries, it's very difficult, as we've seen here in the United States, to confront pandemics amid widespread political polarization and amid a broader distrust in government and expertise, which is, of course, associated with populism. And so, partly for those reasons, I think we are seeing the political fortunes of, obviously, the likes of Donald Trump, but also, populists elsewhere in the world that have been hard hit. Mexico, for example, Brazil, Bolsonaro, just today was diagnosed with COVID-19. We see the political fortunes of some of these populists declining. Now, it's entirely possible that come the second wave, come the fall, come the spring, that could all change. And history suggests that in some political and social contexts, the fortunes of those who appeal to our basest instincts, they seem to rise when there's a period of profound crisis. So the book is not out on this yet, but right now, that is, I think, a hopeful message. And I think it's key for mobilizing action on a whole range of different issues. Of course, preventing another pandemic from happening in the near to intermediate future is part of it, because again, you need those kind of multilateral institutions and agreements and action. But also, I work a great deal on climate change, and I view climate change alongside maybe nuclear proliferation and really ecological collapse driven by species extinction. I view these issues as being the most important of the coming century, most likely. There's a few others that, artificial intelligence that might rise to that level. But in order to confront climate change, populism is very destructive. You do need international cooperation. You do need a long-standing consensus that kind of bridges political divides. And you do need expertise. So for that reason, I think the decline of populism has potentially widespread ramifications in many other areas as well that might be even more important than politics. Frankly, racial justice being another important one of those topics, and I think there's no coincidence that we've seen such a groundswell of popular support for Black Lives Matter in the United States and elsewhere at a time when populists are in command of many societies. Also worth noting, by the way, so this goes back to an earlier point, but that those populists that have been relatively politically successful have done so by modulating their populism, whether that's Doug Ford in the Canadian province of Ontario, of course, where you live, or Boris Johnson in the UK. Well, this is going to be very similar to my answer to question 4, which is just to remain politically engaged. And this has been a common problem, whether it concerns issues of climate change or racial justice, is that there's these punctuation moments, right? Again, going back to climate change after a natural disaster, let's say the fires in Australia recently. But it's not sustained. And because it's not sustained, it doesn't lead to a real sea change in the political structures that led to the problem in the first place. Right? And so to really act on the potential of this moment, people need to remain politically engaged. Obviously, that means voting in elections, but that also means, speaking to one another. That means protesting in many cases. That means getting involved in very local politics, whether that's within corporations, universities, or at the municipal level, at the county level. The key really to mobilizing action, I think, against populism, but more broadly against, or really in favor of action to prevent and to mitigate pandemics or climate change or what have you, is to remain politically engaged on many different scales. So this is very difficult, I think, to answer, again, in part because we're halfway through that first wave, and in part because there's many different ways of answering it, many different areas that are being adversely affected in our societies that might rise or fall in importance over the next few months. But for me right now, what I would flag would be problems in the capabilities or shortcomings in the capabilities and the prestige of democracies. So this is a geopolitical point, but it's also a point related to domestic politics. And what I mean by that is that I think the example of the United States faltering right now is so profound and will be so profound for people around the world that I think it is contributing to a change in the balance of power between the United States and China, but also in the perception of the competence of democracies and authoritarian states, which actually has nothing to do with how competent democracies have been in the face of this crisis versus authoritarian states. There are democracies, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, New Zealand, the list goes on, that have functioned very well. And there are authoritarian states, arguably China, Russia, for example, Turkey, Iran, that have not, right? So this is not connected to any reality, but the United States is still such an important symbol of democracy that I think its abject failure in response to this crisis is dangerous. And I mentioned the capabilities of democracies, and I think this is important because we are spending so much capital and creating so much debt and delaying so many important priority areas, including work to kind of confront climate change and ecological problems, although that might be part of whatever stimulus comes out of this in many societies. But I think what we might be looking at is a sort of long-term degradation in what we're capable of doing in democratic societies that might not exist to the same extent in authoritarian states. And that I particularly mean China, which is, of course, the most important authoritarian state. So I worry that that will affect our ability to mobilize action on a number of other potentially more important areas. That is definitely one thing that concerns me, because the ramifications of that extend to these other areas and therefore could be larger than we might currently expect. I mentioned earlier that staying politically engaged is crucial in order to capitalize on the positive stuff. Well, I think that's also the case for these more negative elements. For example, turning to higher education, it's unconscionable that we don't have stimulus here in the United States for higher ed. Right? $50 billion could alleviate a lot of the problems that we currently have, and that's basically pocket change, considering the amount of money that's flowing through the system right now. So if there was more kind of a groundswell of outrage about the fact that we might be losing many of our universities in the coming years, I think that this would be a very different story. So again, remaining politically engaged, voting, obviously, maybe changing political opinions. I think that's going to be crucial. So as a historian, I would say accurate historical knowledge is very important of how these things end, of what to compare the current pandemic to as we look into the past. There's been a lot of bad history that's been written over the last few months, particularly in major news outlets. But what you want to do is give people a sense that this is a problem that can be overcome and that will be overcome if they act wisely now, and that the less pain they're prepared to accept in the short term, the more pain they will accumulate, they will incur in the long term. Right? So accurate historical knowledge of how pandemics have ended in the past. In 68, 57, for example, in 1918, 1919, this is important. And that's what we kind of need to see more of, I think, going forwards.